you a broad lightning overview to the rose stem girdler. This is a talk that Bev Gerderman and I put together. It's actually a condensed version of that. So this pest comes from a metallic wood boring beetle family, and what's characteristic to it is that the larvae are cambium feeders, and they cause this girdling effect, hence the name. Its hosts are rose family brambles, mostly Rosa and rubus, those in the Rosa rubus genus. It's a pest of caneberries, ornamental rose brambles, as you might expect. This was a long-standing caneberry pest in Europe. The first reports in the U.S. were in the eastern U.S. in the 1870s. It was reported as well established by 1913. And most of the information that we have currently on this actually came from a series of studies from the 1950s and 60s in Utah, where there was an outbreak in raspberry plantings along the Great Salt Lake. It was confirmed in Idaho by the 1970s, so it's steadily been moving west. And then in the Pacific Northwest by 1994 in Eastern Oregon. As of 2014, it was confirmed northward to King County and Spokane counties in Washington. And just general reports are increasing in the greater Willamette Valley of Oregon and Southwest Washington. And last year, we just really confirmed, especially in Southwest Washington, that it's totally widespread. We can find it just about anywhere in wild hosts, in Clark and Cowlitz County at least. Something else that we're finding out is that surveys today are suggesting that the rose stem girdler life cycle and ecology differ in the Pacific Northwest compared to Utah. We're seeing just generally later emergence than the information that came out of Utah, and a longer activity period than was observed in Utah. So typically in Utah, they were seeing up to about 3 weeks of activity, and last year we saw maybe up to 8 weeks of activity, so a pretty big difference. We've also got an abundance of hosts, both wild and cultivated. And just recently we found out there might be a possible natural parasitoid wasp that we found of this pest that's not been reported before. So a quick overview of the life cycle of this pest. So in May to July, females feed on leaves prior to depositing eggs on the stem. And single eggs are laid on the canes, and they hatch in 4 to 14 days and then bore into the cane. From June to July, the first and second larval instars feed in the cambium in a spiral pattern, as you can see in these pictures. By late July, the third larval instar starts to move into the cane pith, or can start moving to the cane pith, and at this point, living tissue is not really required to keep it alive. And by September to October, the larval activity ends, and the fourth instar overwinters in the cane pith. So the next year, around May to July, once temperatures reach a threshold of about 50 degrees Fahrenheit and the relative humidity reaches 60%, pupation can begin. And then for adult development, those numbers are slightly higher at 55 degrees Fahrenheit and 70 degrees relative humidity. So this is an important aspect to understand the development of this pest. It's all about temperature and humidity thresholds versus calendar dates. Typically, adults have been found within canes between late May and June. And the adults, once they develop, they can stay inside the cane for 1 to 3 weeks, and they sort of wait around until temperatures warm up to come out. And when they bore out, they make a little hole like this D-shaped hole, and they have about a 7-day adult lifespan in which they feed and lay eggs and mate and lay eggs. So these are just some more pictures of the symptoms that you'll likely see if you do see this in the field. Classic galls, especially in soft canes and in primocanes, you'll see this classic sort of galling damage. That picture on the right of the Marionberry is sort of more inconspicuous, but if you dig away at it, you can actually see that there was a gall there. Spiral patterned galls are more commonly seen in harder caned varieties, and especially, of course, in second year of canes that have become harder. You can just sort of see those even better in this picture between blackberry and raspberry. If you're in the field and you find damage like this, you can you can carve away the bark of the plant and reveal the tunneling. And a viable rose stem girdler, you'll see an increase in the diameter of the tunnel, and eventually it will go into the cane pith. So this would be scouting during the growing season. You can look for development too. You can look for the stage of development. And that picture on the right is just showing that's one point in time, and you can see that development isn't uniform. There's a general window, a period where they do develop and emerge, but it's not totally uniform. Same, you can confirm rose stem girdler of adults in the field and the emergence. Typically, this has been in late May to early June, past 2 years. Some other monitoring that you can do later in the season, from midsummer to early fall, you'll see wilted top growth, cane breakage, and resprouting beneath the girdling point. You'll also see chewing on the leaves when the adults are feeding during their activity period after emergence, before they lay eggs. You could do active monitoring from late spring to early summer, where you can actively collect the adult population with beating trays, such as in this picture. And possibly there's going to be some opportunities for passive monitoring. There's been some traps that have been able to successfully trap other types of beetles similar to rose stem girdler. But it's not confirmed yet, and just stay tuned with that. So this is another thing that you can do, but it is very tedious. So this is information I got off of AgWeatherNet, and right now our growers, my growers in this region, are counting on me and us, other extension folks, to get this information and relay it to them, where you monitor the temperature data to see when the temperature and humidity thresholds have been met. So this is actually something we want to work on as a grant project, is sort of developing a model that uses this information as a more predictive tool. But right now it's pretty tough for growers to do something like that. So some of the cultural management that's currently being used, cultivar differences. Some people say that they seem to see cultivar differences or difference between raspberry and blackberry, but it's pretty unconfirmed. It seems pretty erratic. Sometimes you see the contrary to what somebody says. One possible difference that might also be going on is whether or not there's different tolerances to rose stem girdler damage. New plantings are something you want to pay attention to the most. By far, if you do have this pest, they can be destroyed or significantly set back when those new canes start coming out if that pest is around, because it can girdle the stem before the root system is well established and can resprout well. Everbearing varieties, in a similar respect, can get stand compromise and, of course, yield loss. Established floricane fruiting varieties, just generally you get yield loss. You don't get an actual stand compromise necessarily. Mechanical strategies are to prune the canes a few inches below the galls if you find the damage, and you've got to destroy or remove the canes from the field. So either burning, chipping, or burying it under 2 inches. And that's because once the larvae are in the cane pith and the fourth instar, it's capable of surviving and emerging from a dead, pruned out cane. So the Utah information is the data that they collected. You could get up to 80% control just from efficient, good, robust pruning alone. So this is a really important aspect. As far as insecticides goes, there are a lot of different insecticides that Utah listed as effective on rose stem girdler and are also labeled for use in caneberries in Washington. Keys are full cover sprays beginning immediately after adult emergence because that's when they're vulnerable. Of course, applications during bloom, you have to adhere to label restrictions, and this is something that's pretty highly likely to happen. Repeat based on the reapplication interval. Generally, you want something between 7 to 14 days because they live for about a week. And we don't really know how long you should spray for. Hopefully it coincides with SWD spraying after a certain point so that you're not just spraying for this pest for a long period of time. Of course, always read and follow label instructions. And basically what you're trying to do is with those full cover sprays, you're trying to get those active residues on leaves so that you get the adults while they're feeding prior to laying eggs. Some of the challenges, there's this very narrow effective insecticide application window. So after emergence, but before egg laying. Emergence timing right now is pretty difficult to determine, and it's pretty important to figuring out your timing because it doesn't adhere to a calendar. It's those temperature and humidity thresholds that I mentioned. Emergence may coincide with bloom. I mentioned this before. This is a risk to pollinators and restricts what you spray and when you can spray it. Intensive pruning, of course, can be labor intensive and expensive. And it's good to note that once rose stem girdler is established in an area, eradication is really unlikely and probably unrealistic because of the persistent present hosts. Some of the strategies, confirm rose stem girdler presence first in the field and in wild hosts adjacent to fields. You want to avoid sprays if there's no symptoms present, and avoid spraying before emergence because it's really a waste of time and resources before then. Consider insecticides for both rose stem girdler and SWD if the timing coincides. And you can use that other information I gave about prioritizing. So number 1, new plantings and everbearing varieties. Number 2, established plantings with obvious infield infestation. And then plantings that are also adjacent to wild hosts that are showing girdler infestation. And you can train your pruning crew to just recognize the damage and when they're out there pruning anyway, to prune accordingly and effectively. The Utah information again showed that between effective pruning and effective insecticide applications, you get near 100% infield control. You'll be able to control the wild hosts as well, but infield control can be pretty good. One thing to note is that we're seeing this out in the field quite a bit, where we've got some canes that are girdled and some that aren't. And when we dig into the canes, sometimes we see the damage, but we don't find a viable rose stem girdler. This is just another picture. And one thing that we found in 2018 was that when we found the spot where we expected to see the rose stem girdler, we found this little catch of parasitoid wasp larvae. And this phenomena was actually reported back in 1940 in Ontario, but hasn't been reported since. So this is fairly new. This is just another picture. We actually took those larvae and reared them out. And it was identified as a part of a subfamily of known parasitoids of emerald ash borer, which is a similar to rose stem girdler, and other parasitoids of rose stem girdler in Europe. So this is sort of an exciting development. We actually found those in 2019 too, and actually a different time of year. So there's a lot that we don't know about this potential parasitoid, and we want to look into that as well. So with that, I think I'm just barely on time and can take any questions if you've got any.
Daryl, hold on a sec. He's definitely not going to be able to hear you.
I can raise my voice. Is this worm quite a bit like the old-fashioned crown borer that we had, and treated somewhat the same way?
It's similar, but distinct. It's not exactly the same. I don't know if Bev is in the audience. I'm less familiar with crown borer. I don't know if she can speak to your question a little bit better.
She's not here, but
okay.
Crown borer is a clear wing moth, and it tends to, the larvae tunnel into the base of the canes, whereas it seems that this tunnels into the upper or mid part of the canes.
It bores into the bottom of the canes, or can bore all along the canes. It depends on the type. But it chews on the cambium before it goes in the pith.
Oh, sorry. In the adult stage, is the beetle a flying beetle, or how mobile is that unit?
Yeah, it is a flying beetle. It is mobile. We don't know how far it goes. That's actually one thing that we want to look into, because sometimes people are getting inadvertent control just from pruning, just from routine pruning, but it's coming in from wild hosts on the field periphery. And we want to gauge how far it moves in a given season.